think it's great that we're going right after Jack. I think that's a great pre-work. Mary is going to introduce herself first with her slides, and then we'll do Mike after that.
So, hi everybody. I like to think of myself as the reality coach. The title of our discussion today is Getting Cellular Agriculture into the Real World. And I do think it was a great follow-up to what Jack had to say, because it was super great for me, a non-scientist, to listen to a very well-presented explanation of really how the science behind this is working and some of the challenges that you face. And as Isha mentioned, I'm the principal of Hyde Park Group, Food Innovation in Chicago, and I'm a consumerist. So my background is in communications, advertising, market research, strategy. And so what I do is I work with very high-level chefs and packaging designers to connect consumer insight to food and package design, putting the consumer front and center in the process. And I would like my message, my takeaway to you to be, it's not too early to start thinking that way. You have a beautiful baby, which is cellular agriculture, but it's time to take off the rose-colored glasses, and you gotta see that product and that idea through the consumer's eyes. I'm going to skip that one. These are some of the clients that we work with. You know, big food, they're not your enemy. They could, in fact, be your best friends. They have a lot of the knowledge and resources and equipment that can really accelerate this into the marketplace. But those are decisions that you're going to have to make as you think about your goals in terms of getting it into the marketplace and funding things. But we've learned a lot from Big Food, and I've been approached by a number of entrepreneurs, particularly in the last year, and some of you are here today, in terms of how we might be able to help you. Big Food has a very kind of strategic stage gate process that you move new products through. And it starts with opportunity and discovery, which is informed by trends, by marketplace analysis, and identifying white spaces and platforms, and then drilling it down and creating concepts and feeding that back to the consumer, and then creating actual products and getting consumer feedback on that as well. And what we do, I think, really well, and I think this is why a lot of our clients come back to us, is we're really firm believers in rapid protocepting, where we're creating that 3D experience for the consumer, and we're doing iterative research to make sure we've not only got the idea, but we've got the food and we have the package. And I can't stress enough how much the littlest thing changes a yes into a no. You can have the best idea and the highest value product, morals and values, but you know what? If you put an idea out there and the meat looks a little funky, it looks a little gray, they take a bite of it and the texture is kind of spongy, you're dead in the water. And you only get one shot with the consumer with new technology too. So it's really super important that you start to think about the consumer and put them front and center at this juncture. In talking to some of the entrepreneurs, they really get that they need to wrap their heads around consumer-centric development and thinking of this as a business. But a lot of times they don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the money, or they don't have the people set up yet. They're living from VC round to VC round. So I put this together for my entrepreneurial friends, because I can't really help you until you're a little bit further down the road. And this is what I call a zipline checklist. You can go online to that address, and it's got all the questions and a wealth of resources you can turn to start saying, how do we think about commercializing this product, and what are the resources I can go to sort of get myself launched down that direction. So as you think about transitioning from your pitch to investors to your pitch to consumers, I think this would be a helpful resource for you, and thank you. I'm delighted to meet all of you.
Hi, I'm Mike Lee. I'm founder of the Future Market. The Future Market is actually a project that is part of a parent company of which I'm a co-founder of called Alpha Food Labs. Alpha Food Labs is an innovation platform for food companies. We design food products. So we help companies ideate, think of, and take the product development process throughout and go to market with new ideas and new products. But I'm here to talk about the Future Market and what that is. In 1940, my grandfather moved to Detroit, and he started one of the first Chinese restaurants out there. And a part of growing up in Detroit, one of the things that you did all the time was go to auto shows. The auto show was like my favorite thing to do every year, not because I was a car nut, but it was because I saw concept cars. And I just really floored me at how a whole industry as big as complex as the auto industry could codify this whole process by which they invest money into creating concepts that tried to imagine a future, a different future of where that industry could go. These weren't commercially available, they weren't meant to be that. It was merely a vision to try to inspire how people innovate in that industry. Fast forward a lot of years to me working in the food industry with a lot of food companies and going to a lot of food shows, and you don't really see that level of ambition too often. And I wanted to sort of change that, and I wanted to say, how could we kind of get the industry to think more ambitiously? And start to concept out things that maybe don't exist as a way to kind of reframe thinking and inspire people to maybe zig versus zag. I get that you can't turn on a dime in the food industry that easily, but could we use concept products to inspire people to think a lot more ambitiously? And that really led to our mantra of what the Future Market is that better innovation in food today starts with more ambitious thinking about tomorrow. So we created the Future Market as a space. It's a virtual space most of the year, except for twice a year at the Fancy Food Show, where we have a 1,000 square foot physical installation, where it's a grocery store that you may or may not recognize, but it's filled with conceptual products. All products that aren't for sale, they don't exist, but they take early stage trends of what's happening today, like cellular ag, and it says, what happens when that early stage technology or trend or consumer behavior becomes mature and becomes mass? So we're trying to imagine the world through concept products that way and start a conversation about what are the implications of when cellular agriculture goes mass. So there's a shot of the grocery store that we had in the Fancy Food Show here in New York. We'll be at the San Francisco Fancy Food Show in January as well with the same exhibition. Today here, you may have seen this yesterday, but we're showing off a concept of a conceptual Chinese restaurant from the year 2038 that imagines a world where cellular ag is already mature, it's already been figured out, it's already accessible. And a lot of what we do is try to take quote-unquote scary, unfamiliar ideas and concepts and pair them with things that are very familiar. I grew up in a Chinese restaurant family, and Chinese food is one of the most popular kind of takeout things to eat for everyone. So we said, let's combine those two. Let's take something that is quote-unquote scary and throw it in a package that people recognize and have comfort for, which is Chinese takeout. It may look like the average Chinese menu on the surface, but if you look really close, we have a lot of kind of just little details that kind of show off the implications of what could happen on Cell Ag for the average Chinese grocery store. So things like shark fin soup, which is sort of taboo and kind of a no-no to have right now. Where do your values shift once you can start to cellular agriculture and grow those things? How does that change how you think about it? So that's some of the things and the themes that we want to provoke you with, taking sort of an artist and designer's perspective on the future of cellular agriculture. So we've set up the whole ecosystem around the Future Market to keep doing these concepts because we want to win the hearts and minds of people in food on early stage technologies. We do concept products, we have food experiences. Last year we did an entire dinner on the past, present, and future of protein. We do scenario planning workshops and prototyping and testing with all of our clients. I'll leave you with one anecdote that kind of encapsulates the spirit of what we're trying to do with the Future Market, and that's the story of Martin Cooper. Martin Cooper was the head of the Motorola lab in the 70s, and he's the father of the cell phone. His team created the first prototypes of the cell phone. And what's remarkable is not just that, but what's remarkable is that he's gone on record many times to say that one of his inspirations for creating the cell phone was actually Captain Kirk, and looking at things like that phone in his hand, which sort of looks like the original StarTAC. So that really floored me, and it really kind of reinforced the role that kind of speculative design and science fiction almost can have on people that have the wherewithal to change industries and invent new things. Everything that we're doing with the future market is to try to create loops like this, Captain Kirk's inspiring Martin Cooper's, and that's what we're all about. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. I really love those T-shirts. I wish we had a T-shirt gun.
We've had a lot of requests for these, so I think we're going to check the website. There's actually a website for this restaurant. We'll have some soon.
So my takeaways from your presentations is that, Mary, you are a consumerist, and Mike, you're a conceptualist. Yes? Would you agree?
I could put that. Yeah, I
Okay,
can put that.
cool. With those hats on, what do you think are the biggest marketing challenges for cellular agriculture?
First and foremost, I think Jack touched on this, is the communication about what business you're in, and how does that resonate with the consumer. There have been a lot of terms that have been used, throughout the day and a half in terms of clean meat or lab meat, and you do have kind of a dichotomy going on with the consumer in that there's been a big push over the last 5 years or so for fewer ingredients, unprocessed foods, clean labels, getting anything that sounds like a laboratory ingredient off the label. And then on the other hand, we have lab meat, so those are two conflicting thoughts that kind of have to come into focus, and the way to get focus is putting the consumer front and center. The other thing is, I think the dialogue has to flip from an investor pitch to a consumer pitch. And what I mean by that is, I think the investors are looking at big game-changing shifts in our world and, in the way we serve the world with our agriculture. The consumer has a different approach to it. They vote first with their eyes, their senses, their stomach, second with their wallet, and then they rationalize with some of the values and the morals that your product represents. So as you, kind of kiss your beautiful baby and step aside and take the glasses off, you have to really think about, how is this product delivering for the consumer? What is the familiar frame of reference for them? And what is the price point that I want to come in at? Because the higher the price point, the more narrow your market is. And I know that's going to come down over time. So I'll put taste first and price second.
Okay.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with, I think, what Mary said, and I think there's a lot of challenges on the list. I mean, the science alone, the regulatory aspect, all those things aside, the paradox of natural versus kind of unnatural, quote unquote, is something really unwieldy to deal with. But I think as an industry, you have to find a way to speak to the aspirations of what food means to people. Because you think about the rise of processed foods in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and things like that, people weren't really investigating too much about where your food was coming from or how it was made. And there were some really kind of weird creations that came out of that phase. Because the aspiration of, I don't have to cook anymore because I'm back in the workforce or I'm free from the kitchen, overshot what the value of where your food came from was. So I think you have to always kind of speak to the bigger aspiration of what food means, besides just nutrition and calories. Right now, I think food, also just happens to mean it's a vote for a different kind of system in the world, right? So I would look at how you're playing up to people's sensitivities around sustainability and resource use and things like that. That to me, for now, seems like a good entryway in. But again, that could shift from generation to generation, as we know that each generation has their own kind of neuroses and aspirations.
Yes. Mary, you mentioned in your kind of sequence of events, as you work with big companies right now, usually it's the trend that exists first and the company's designing something for it. But I think with cellular agriculture, it's not that a trend exists yet. It's just we care about this thing and we're almost trying to make it a trend via making it a product. So do you think that there's, what do you think needs to come first? Do you think we need to be talking about it and create a trend first, or do you think we actually need to see what the products are before we assume what people want?
I think that's a great question. I think you have a really great opportunity to A, find the right name for what you're doing, B, to define it, C, to maybe put some type of a tracking study in place that can kind of, over time, measure awareness of, your name and your key messaging points. And then fourth, put some type of a public relations kind of effort in place. I know there's been a lot of press about this, but you want to make sure that you're controlling what that press is and that you're messaging out a very consistent name, a very consistent message about it, and hopefully making it from your early adopters into a longer term kind of commitment to that communication. And I think that's the groundwork that you can lay as you do things like get GRAS status and get through all your regulatory things and fine-tune your product. But even in the communication of what name you pick and how you talk about it, put the consumer in the middle of it too, because there are terms like clean that mean certain things to consumers. They've already been co-opted by other foods, and even very close in your own industry, and they stand for different things. So make sure you're choosing the right term to talk about it. And the other thing is, I think you need to also understand what your community priorities are for the development of these products, because there's going to be a trade-off between resources and time and having all of the value-driven things checked. So, for example, they talked about, does this need to be GMO yesterday? Does this need to be vegan? Do we need to get rid of any kind of animal resource in it? Do you care about it? Does the consumer care about it? And maybe what the consumer cares about is we're not slaughtering animals anymore. End of story. They don't care if it's non-GMO. They don't care if it's animal product. I can't answer that for you, but I think that those are the types of things that you're going to have to kind of come to grips with is, do we want to add more cost and more time to this to get every single box checked, or are we going to try to understand what's really going to resonate with the consumer and go in that direction?
Right. Mike, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think as a product designer, I look at cellular ag as a really great opportunity to think, okay, there's two kind of divergent strategies you can take from a product development standpoint. One is just simply mimicking everything that already exists, so making hamburgers and meatballs and being familiar and taking that sort of familiar route in, like Impossible and Beyond have done with plant-based stuff. And then there's the other path, which I think is more interesting, is, what kind of foods can cell ag meat make that you just can't typically make in conventional agriculture, right? So like little things like razor thin meat chips and things like that, like could that be a thing? So I think as just looking at it from a product development standpoint, it's a whole new palette from which to paint with. And I think both of those strategies can kind of be explored concurrently to kind of infuse newness, but also still anchor yourself to some sort of familiarity. I think that can't be understated. There's a reason that cars are rated in horsepower, is because you need something to anchor yourself in something you knew before when you're introducing something so new.
I think that innovate versus imitate thing is particularly interesting, especially, Mary, when you mentioned that when a consumer tries something and the texture is just slightly off or the color is slightly different or the package smells a certain way when you open it, that can be such a deal breaker. So I wonder, for cellular agriculture, considering that a lot of these companies are still in the R&D phase, do you think they should try to imitate, or do you think they should try to innovate, or do you think...
I think that the first product should be along the line of a familiar frame of reference. You want to remove all the barriers that you can from consumers adopting it. You have so many other things that you need them to buy into. Don't make it be a frankenfood that they've never seen before.
Right.
You want to say, it's okay, come on in. It's not going to hurt you, it's not going to bite. It's kind of like what you eat all the time, and that should be your first step in. And one thing I want to say is in a lot of research that we do on new products, sadly, we often see a reverse correlation between need-desire, meaning I really do want this product, I want to try it, and uniqueness. So you have to be very careful about this, because just because it's unique and different oftentimes doesn't correlate with I actually want to buy or eat it.
Is there an example of that you can think of?
Oh my gosh. Let's see. There are very common examples that you would be surprised. We had kiwi up here. That's one of those flavors that when it first kind of got used in more commercial products, that people said, yeah, that's interesting, unique flavor combination, but it's not something that I want to taste or buy. So, I mean, you don't have to throw the ball very, very far to find that consumer resistance on new things. You know that as well. So,
Mike, do you agree that the first product should err on the side of familiarity? Not err, but
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think we very strategically use the idea of a Chinese takeout restaurant as sort of the cloud cover for this, because I do believe that when you have something very kind of unfamiliar, you need to anchor that in something very familiar. And so yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about the future of when products and ideas become boring, because I think once it becomes boring and mundane, it's penetrated the mainstream, right?
Do you think that familiarity needs to exist in food? Because you mentioned the car show, which is not a food thing, but you're taking something that is familiar, but making it a food thing. Do you think that it's possible to create a cultured meat product that is familiar, but maybe it's not familiar as meat? Maybe it's familiar as another very familiar food product.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think the analogy sort of breaks down when you think about kind of innovation in other industries and innovation in food. I think food is special and it's different. There's nothing really more intimate than food, and I think people are much more apt to get the iPhone 10 than they are to. It's paradox, because they want the iPhone 10, but they want like version 1.0 of food, right?
Right.
So I think it's just much more conservative in the food industry for sure.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, we saw like the hamburger, the meatball, the chicken strip, and then I remember Modern Meadow was having tastings of these meat chips. And so, they were familiar, but as a potato chip, but they were not a potato chip. And so I'm just wondering if you think these kind of cross products are an interesting entry point.
I think the meat chip's a very interesting idea, and it is giving people a familiar frame of reference in the chip. So your frame of reference doesn't have to be a meat analog. It can be a snack analog. It can be something else they're familiar with. If you say it's kind of like this, but it has that. So, but again, it's you have a lot that you're asking the consumer to buy into right off the bat. So make it safe to come in the water first,
Yes.
and then quickly introduce other innovations down the road.
To the meat chip, one of the concepts we have on the menu at our conceptual restaurant is just a bag full of Peking duck skin that's cultured,
Nice.
right? So, even the meat chip might kind of weird people out because that just literally doesn't exist right now. But looking at places where, okay, when you eat Peking duck, what's the best part of eating Peking duck? In my opinion, it's the skin. Why can't there just be a whole bag of that? And so, if someone's working on that right now,
Before I even started working in this world, my grandma once said to me, "Wouldn't it be great if the chicken was made entirely of skin?"
I agree.
So
I agree.
I wanted to bring up one thing that you mentioned about naturalness. Do you think naturalness is a trend, or do you think we're just hardwired to want it?
Well, natural in the food business is a really bounced around term. There is no clear definition of what a natural product is. There's a lot of consumer suspicion about that term. If that were something you were going to rest your whole marketing story on, I would suggest not doing that. When it's used in combination with other types of benefits for your product, it can be believable. The more specific you can be, the better. If you have no preservatives, you're ABF free, you're no artificial additives, those types of things are a little bit more meaningful. Just because natural, consumers know that it's sort of an empty promise.
But Mike, you mentioned the 60s being a big time for food innovation, and I would say that time probably naturalness was not as much of a priority.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think this is why the takeaway is to make sure you're constantly getting onto the lab, and like Mary said, keep a really good finger on the pulse of how culture is moving, because I think when we think about the future of food, we think so much about the technology, and that's sort of easier to extrapolate. It's harder to extrapolate how generational shifts will happen, right? So just imagine you're a baby and you've been grown up in a world where cell ag is just there all the time, right? How do your opinions of that change, right? So it's hard to tell. Natural happens to be the kind of word du jour right now, I think. But again, it might take a generational shift for things to take on. I really believe that kind of innovation happens when technology and culture can move in lockstep. People have to be ready for things, and yeah, that might take some time.
For sure. I think we're going to go a little bit over time because we have so many questions. The first one is for Mary. How do we prevent clean meat from coming to market too soon when it is subpar, for example, gray or spongy, and ruining its reputation?
I think that's the center of my message to you. I would put together some type of an expert panel, trained in consumer tasting, so a tasting panel. And I would involve them at every step along the way. I'm not a scientist, so I don't really know how this impacts, but when I heard you guys talking about different media and different scaffolding, and someone even said silk, and I was like, how is that going to affect the taste, and how is that going to affect the texture? And maybe before you make a huge investment in this type of science, you should weigh in with the consumer to see how they feel about it. Because I would hate to see you go down a science path where you're building a certain type of scaffolding only to find out it really is not preferred by the consumer. So that's what I would do.
I think part of the challenge is that we're still, at least the research that we're supporting is still in such early stages that we still have to work with like biomedical supplies just to kind of make the innovations that push the whole field along. So I guess related to timing, when do you think is the best time to start working with, for instance, chefs or the people that you put together in your expert panels?
It's hard for me to say because I literally didn't taste any of the products here today, so I couldn't say if it is today. But I think as soon as you have a consumable product, it's time to think about it. Now, you also have to really think about the safety issue, though, too, because you don't have GRAS status yet, and when we do consumer work, we're not putting products out there that haven't really gone through, a safety testing process. You don't want anybody to get sick, and you don't want any toxicity, and I'm sure your products won't have it, but you don't want that liability hanging over your head. So that's why I think an expert tasting panel might be the better route to go, because you're not exposing it to anybody in the public. But I would say as soon as you feel you have a consumable product that you guys are trying and saying, yeah, this is pretty good, we like it, and we think that this is what we were aiming for, then get the consumer tasting panel involved right away.
Cool. I'm going to direct this question at Mike. How do people respond to VC Silicon Valley stories on foods? Should cell-ad companies make more of an effort to engage with the Midwest?
You don't want to fall into the Juicero trap where you're solving a problem that doesn't exist. I think that the VC area is interesting right now because there's a lot of money out there, and arguably some of them are going towards ideas that maybe aren't actually solving a problem. So not just in the Midwest. I mean, it's so important to just continually kind of stay out there with consumers and make sure you're solving real problems, and not just getting around the hype circle of people are getting this valuation or that valuation.
It kind of reminds me of Mary's point of you have your VC pitch and you have your consumer pitch.
Totally.
Another question, Mary, what is a good/bad first way to present lab-grown meat? Must we take lab-grown meat to a Michelin star chef or a tastemaker to light a fire?
Interesting thought. We have gone down that direction and given it to molecular gastronomists. I know there's probably some people here from Hampton Creek. I worked with Homaro Cantu for many years. He was he did some of the early work on the Hampton Creek products, but he had a restaurant in Chicago called Moto, and he was a real tinkerer and kind of a food scientist / chef. And those types of chefs are really great at imagining what this type of product can do, and in being very real too about whether or not it's ready for prime time. You don't want something just smothered in spices and sauces because the basic product isn't that great, and that'll get you a lot of press and things like that. So it's an interesting way to go to kind of demonstrate what can be done with the product. But it's not necessarily something you would expose to the consumer. The consumer wants to know, what can I put on the table for dinner that week, if it's a hamburger or a taco, or how does this fit into my weekly repertoire of food? And that's really where you've got to think about these products.
Mm-hmm. For Mike, do you think we're overthinking the language of CellAg? Should we be more concerned about a funding foundation that inspires trust in consumers?
The trust is important, but I personally don't think we're kind of overthinking the name, because I think the name does matter. I think names matter. It's the difference between the Patagonian toothfish and Chilean sea bass.
Yes.
Which one would you rather eat? I mean, I think Jack's presentation touched on that huge. There's a fine line between overthinking and being neurotic about it, but I think it should be a thing that is considered very carefully and methodically, because names stick. And you don't want the wrong name to stick.
Do you think that it's even within our control to decide the name?
That's the dicey part. I don't think it is. There's many case studies of industry groups, like again Jack talked about, that have gone out with a charge to say, I've rebranded this, and those work. But there's probably other instances where it hasn't worked at all. So,
with that, for the last question, what's a good name for cultured meat?
Cultured meat.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the actual phrase is, but something, that evokes more of this idea of fermentation and things like that. I think if we always think about what area can you draft off of, fermentation is something that is very, I think, positive. I mean, pretty much a lot of good things come from that. So I would start thinking in that circle.
Cool.
And I like cultured because of its relationship to cultured dairy.
Yes.
And it's a term that consumers already know. They feel is natural. It's been around. It's familiar. It doesn't have any scary science associated with it. So, at least in America, I mean, fermentation's been around for centuries, but a little bit more in other countries than here. Cultured is I think a safe way into that conversation.
Cool. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.